Korea broke its own record for the world's lowest fertility rate last year, with the count dropping to 0.78. And this news made global headlines, as did coverage about the risks of regional radiation given North Korea's nuclear weapons tests. So how are authorities here responding to reports about the risks of radiation? What lessons can Korea learn about childbirth and care from France? And is the local economy prepared for external uncertainties as seen by the BOK? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. We start the work week today with a check on stories from this part of the world that made international headlines over the past week. For more, I have Nicolas Rocca here in the studio. Nicolas, it's good to have you back.
Good to be here.
I also have Thomas Maresca with us. Thomas, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Right, Thomas, let's start off then on the social front with your report about Korea breaking its own record for the world's lowest fertility rate at 0.78 in the year 2022. What were some of the reasons, Thomas, that you touched upon to explain this grim finding?
It's most economically developed countries have some version of a falling birth rate. It seems that South Korea has a lot of those factors, but almost kind of in a perfect storm of equation of driving the birth rate down. I mean, some of the main things are just economic uncertainty, the high cost of housing and the high cost of education and the competitiveness of the education market and the competitiveness of the job market, are kind of keeping young people from settling down and starting families in the first place. And I think with the low birth rate, the projections are that the population is going to decline rather dramatically, actually. I think the sort of mid-range projection is like from 52 million now to 38 million by 2070. Plus, you've got an aging society, so the question is who's going to support this shrinking workforce and aging population that needs welfare. So I think that also reinforces the idea of what's the future going to hold for me, and not to mention my children. And I think probably with South Korea too, one of the major points is just women are really kind of pushing back at the idea of having children. I mean, just in terms of gender inequality, workforce issues, a lot of women report, it's difficult to. You almost have to choose really between a career and having a child. You face a lot of barriers at work if you're pregnant. Plus, the majority of household chores are still really handled by women here. So I think you're seeing that as another major factor, and kind of all of those things together, have led to this.
Right, and while Korea is dealing with that, Nicolas, I understand the French are reportedly the fertility champions of Europe, if I may. Could you explain this for us? And are there lessons perhaps that Korea could learn from the French?
Well, there's, as Thomas mentioned, a plurality of factors when it comes to fertility. Even in France, the rate is around 1.8 children per woman, and there's complaints about the fact that it's too low because it's the lowest since 1946. So as Thomas mentioned, every developed economy is facing the same issue. But some of the answers that maybe Korea could look into would be, first, I would think family subsidies. The studies I've watched show that in Europe, countries in the north of Europe tend to have a higher birth rate than countries in the south, and they are also the countries that creates, I would say, maybe a more convenient atmosphere for women to give birth, with pregnancy leave that are easier to get. As Thomas mentioned also, there's a healthier maybe work, personal life balance, where it's not perceived maybe for a woman as a disadvantage to have children for her career. For instance, in Sweden, I've seen they gave a 16-month parental leave that can be split equally or the way you want between the two parents, so that could be an idea. In France, we've recently raised the leave for the father that is now 32 days. So all of that, I think, contributes into creating an atmosphere where it feels safer and more convenient to have children. Another factor that is more of maybe a French specialty in Europe is that it's easier to put your children to school, and you can put it into school earlier. So maybe it lowers the burden, financial burden for the family that doesn't have to either have one of the two parents that stays at home or have to pay a private institution for the children. So that might be some of the lessons, but I think the main one is to create a comfortable atmosphere so that it's seen as something that you do for your own good, and that doesn't hurt your work life.
Right, I'm sure that's something that women here can relate to. Moving forward, Thomas, you also covered a rather alarming story about North Korea's nuclear tests posing radiation risks for this particular region. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so there was a report issued by Seoul-based, they're really a rights group called the Transitional Justice Working Group. And, you know, it's nothing new, this speculation that North Korean nuclear tests, these underground nuclear tests at their Punggye-ri facility, they've done 6 since, you know, between 2016 and, or 2006 and 2017, that there may have been some radiation leakage from those tests. I mean, North Korea has never really allowed anybody to check. And so, you know, the idea that that leakage could have gotten into the groundwater is kind of what this report was looking at, trying to model how far of an area might be affected. And that whole part of North Korea, a lot of people there use groundwater for their, you know, everyday needs, including drinking and agriculture. So they you know, they looked at a range of around 40 kilometers around the nuclear test site, which is where like 1 million people live or so. That, so, you know, they were saying hundreds of thousands could have been affected. And, you know, as far as it relates to people here, you know, there are around 900, something 881 North Korean defectors from that region who are in South Korea. And in 2017 to 2018, the Unification Ministry here actually tested 40 of the defectors and found that from that region, it found that 9 of them had, you know, possible sort of chromosomal abnormalities, but didn't feel like they could draw a direct connection to that site. You know, at the same time, there are agricultural and marine products that still make their way out of that area that could, you know, they're basically smuggled through China and could impact populations in Japan or here. Something like pine mushrooms is considered a specialty. And just after this report came out a few days ago, the Unification Ministry here said they would test these other, you know, the 881 defectors. I mean, I think some of it in the past, or at least this report, kind of accused the previous administration of not pursuing this because of trying to keep relations, you know, on a nice level with North Korea. But now, you know, with the prospect of another nuclear test, you know, seemingly imminent from North Korea, I think this has become an issue again that people want to look to. So, right, there's a health side of it, you know, not to mention all the security and other
right.
factors.
And staying with inter-Korean news, Nicholas, in an interview with CNN, our foreign minister, Park Jin, that is, he said North Korea is a clear threat and that South Korea's security concerns extend well beyond the Korean Peninsula. Could you tell us a bit more about his words, and also what are their broader implications?
So I think first of all there's the fact, yes, I mean the North Korean nuclear arsenal has become way more important those last year. It has developed in size, but also in quality, in diversity in a way. Just the last North Korean parade for the anniversary of the North Korean Army showed an impressive number of long-range ballistic missiles. One North Korean expert or nuclear expert, Ankit Panda, pointed out that the number of missiles that were showcased, long-range ballistic missiles that were showcased, could theoretically overwhelm the U.S. You know, missile defense. Of course, that's all theories because we don't actually know how well those missiles would perform in a real-life scenario. But that just shows how much the nuclear arsenal of North Korea has been diversified. And if we take the Hwasong 17 ICBM, I mean, just factually, yes, it is a broader security implication for the rest of the world, considering that most of the world is actually theoretically, again, endangered, and they can hit, you know, any given point almost any given point on the planet. While saying that, I think that you know, every political message also has, you know, other ambitions and other strategy. Perhaps what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is trying to do while saying that is that more people, more countries should be concerned of what's going on in North Korea, and maybe trying to gain more international support on that issue, because since the failure of the negotiations between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, I mean, it's still a very important national issue, but maybe with, the war in Ukraine and the crisis in Taiwan in the region, it has not been on top of the diplomatical issues that have been addressed. And perhaps there's also a message to the United States, right? He gives this interview to CNN. It's also a message to the United States, and it's not a secret that this administration wants an extended U.S. military presence in South Korea, more, assets moving into South Korea, and to kind of ensure South Koreans' defense and be sure that the U.S. are ready to protect their allies. So I think maybe that's the message that Park Jin was trying to send there.
Right, and speaking about messages, Thomas, speculation continues over the reason behind the frequent appearance of Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim Joo, at State Affairs. And one theory is that he may be seeking to modernize North Korea's image. How feasible is this particular theory, do you think?
Well, I think clearly some message is being sent. There's no accident that she's appearing this frequently. I think it's been 7 times now. She appeared again this weekend since November. But a little bit to reflect what Nicolas was saying too. It's kind of who is the message being sent to, I think, is always a question in terms of what we see in North Korean media. And is it a message for the outside world or domestically? To me, the idea that he's trying to modernize the image of North Korea, maybe to an outside audience, seems a little bit less likely now, because just the stance that North Korea is taking is such this kind of militaristic and position. Maybe a few years ago, it seemed to be this kind of softening of the image when the détente was going on. So, I don't quite know that is what I would think about it. I think to me, it seems a little bit more aimed at the local audience and something that is kind of, reinforcing this dynastic image of the Kim regime. I mean, it's almost kind of their legitimacy of their rule is tied into this idea that they are like a dynastic lineage. So I think that might be kind of, some sort of message that is being put out there. At the same time, yes, Kim Jong-un is maybe a little bit more progressive in terms of women having roles in the North Korean, establishment than his father or, grandfather did. I mean, obviously, his sister is a looming large figure, but, at the same time, she's also not in that direct line of succession. So this might be kind of some message sending that, we're already kind of, looking ahead to the next wave, as I think he might be trying to, maintain a sense of, support or legitimacy for his regime in the midst of some challenging times within North Korea.
Right. Meanwhile, Nicolas, earlier this year, I believe you did a piece on how the war in Ukraine was affecting the two Koreas. Do you care to elaborate on that coverage?
Yeah, so it's not news that South Korea and North Korea don't agree on most of the conflicts going out in the world. It's been the case for Vietnam. It's been the case for Syria. It's pretty much always the case. What I found interesting here was the strategic implication that it had for both countries, what it actually meant for North Korea. On one side, they've shown a lot of support to the Russian war invasion of Ukraine. They've been one of the first countries to recognize Luhansk and Donetsk republics. They also said they would be willing to send their workforce to help rebuild those regions. So if they're doing that, there's first, I think, an interest on the international scene. They've been seeking more support. It's a very isolated country, and Russia has been voting against sanctions at the UN Security Council, which is pretty interesting for a country that is testing missiles and at the rate that it is currently. There's that. There's also, in a way, a financial opportunity, even though it's hard to know to which extent. But there's been a U.S. intelligence report showing that the North Korea has sent munitions, weapons to Wagner Group on one side, directly to the Russian army to another. We don't know how important it is, but of course, the imports and exports of North Korea has been very low. So it's pretty interesting for them to get some money, some exchange, and there's also maybe behind broader implication afterwards for North Korea. Maybe they could have some energy coming in from Russia that has a lot to offer on that side. So yeah, we'll see, but it's kind of a win-win situation for North Korea. On the South Korean side, There's been some implication indirectly. I mean, South Korea is providing support to Ukraine, non-lethal support, no weapons. But, you know, the overall situation that it created was also an opportunity for the very, you know, elaborated defense exports industry. I mean, South Korea has been producing a lot of weapons, and it has been signing, you know, very impressive deal with Poland, $15 billion this summer. It's the biggest deal ever for South Korea. So it allows, you know, NATO countries to, you know, give weapons to Ukraine on one side and see that they still keep a decent enough stock of weapons for their future defense. But there's also an increasingly big amount of pressure on South Korea to provide more maybe direct assistance to Ukraine, as when the chief of NATO came to this country, he made quite clear he was willing to have more direct support. And now that South Korea is a big player in a way in the arms export industry, I think the pressure is going to mount up.
Right, and staying with that, Thomas, what do you believe are the prospects of military support from South Korea directly to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, I mean, Nicolas touched on, I think, you know, the major factors at play. I mean, for South Korea, obviously, they've been hesitant to fully, you know, commit directly to giving military support, you know, and it's a little of this threading the needle that South Korea finds itself in a number of the bigger geopolitical conflicts going on. I mean, there's, you know, it's kind of between US and China on certain levels. And, you know, obviously Russia is a big neighbor, you know, so South Korea's tread quite carefully. But yeah, as Nicolas mentioned, you know, the NATO head, you know, directly sort of mentioned it. You know, there have been reports that the US has also kind of behind the scenes been asking South Korea to deliver support. You know, I think ultimately, it might come down to how long does this go on? I mean, at some point, you know, if it just stretches on and on, you know, a number of other countries, you know, South Korea points to its own policy of not directly providing lethal support to countries that are at war, but, you know, a lot of other countries have kind of changed their policies already, and, you know, countries you wouldn't necessarily expect to get involved, like Germany, you know, selling tanks, or, you know, Japan has been quite active. So I think, you know, it's at some point, you know, if this drags on and on, you would imagine maybe South Korea would have to sort of more firmly plant its flag in the camp. But, you know, as Nicolas also mentioned, there are these kinds of sales to NATO countries. There was a transfer of ammunition to the US that a lot of people thought was going to make its way back around to. So
we'll just have to wait and see then.
I think some of that will, yeah, if it ended tomorrow, South Korea would be off the hook, but maybe if it continues for a long, drawn-out period,
then we really wouldn't know. Right, Nicolas, starting Wednesday, travelers from neighboring China will no longer be required to take PCR tests upon arrival. What more can you tell us about the recent ease in COVID-19 related restrictions on China by South Korea?
Well, I think it makes sense to end it now, even though we can doubt the numbers that come out of China for COVID. It seems like the worst of the wave has passed. So it made sense to implement it when it was done. You know, the numbers were very high, very impressive. The estimations were very impressive. There's a specialist close to the Chinese government that mentions somewhere around 80% of the population. So it could create, you know, new strains, maybe more lethal, more dangerous ones. So it definitely made sense to implement those PCR testing there. Then what made maybe a bit less sense was the visa restrictions that created this little, you know, diplomatic tit for tat with China, which is unclear how successful it was to prevent people, Chinese travelers, to coming. And, you know, China also called it a discrimination. But I think it did make sense for South Korea to do it that way. Also, I would like to point out that it was very efficient also because it was done in Incheon airport. There's one port of entry, so it's easier to control more efficiently the travelers coming in from China.
Right. Thomas, on the economic front, there was quite a bit of international coverage about the Bank of Korea holding its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5%, and the governor also speaking about being prepared for external uncertainties. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so I think that was the consensus prediction. Almost everyone thought that was going to be the case, and it's really pretty much looked at as a, you know, just a wait and see move, you know, because you know, the central bank has risen rates, you know, at the last, I think, 7 meetings. It's, you know, risen every single time since April of last year, and so I think at this moment it was just a chance to pause, and because there are a number of uncertain factors, which the governor talked about. I mean, obviously, like what happens with inflation is going to be a major factor, and just what's going to happen. Korea's economy is so export dependent still, so there's a lot of factors at play, like China. With its COVID sort of opening up, what's going to happen on that front, and just the Ukraine war continues to create such a sense of like a global economic uncertainty. What the U.S. Fed is going to do as well. So, I think the governor left open certainly the possibility that there would be a rate raise. Maybe just even by the next meeting, which is in April. One thing I've read, some feel that his projections are actually a bit optimistic. I mean, the bank also lowered the GDP growth projection for this year from like 1.7 to 1.6%. But some people have read, that's actually, I think, higher than other sort of consensus projections. And the governor has seemed to indicate that maybe inflation will drop to like 3% by the end of the year, which would keep the rates at their same level. So, it's obviously, Korea's interconnected so much with major global supply chains, and so there's obviously like a lot of interest in what's going to happen. But I think this just really indicates we're at this point of such incredible uncertainty that it's hard to make a call.
Right. And Nicolas, Thomas mentioned exports here in the country, and they've been on a downward trend, with the exception of shipments of cars. That being said, what can you share with us about the popularity of Korean electric vehicles over in Europe? Well,
they are very popular. I've just seen that the Kia EV6 was elected Car of the Year in Europe. I think there's a Hyundai electric vehicle that was also number 3rd. So overall, in the top 20 most sold electric vehicles, 4 of them are Korean, which is a pretty impressive number. Overall in Europe, there's a surge for electric vehicles, and I think that's a great opportunity of growth for South Korean car makers, car manufacturers, because there's an overall policy on electric vehicles. In 2035, the European Commission decided that no other car than electric car could be sold on the European market, even though we don't know how well it's going to be implemented. As always with EU, not every country agree, and it might be complicated. But there's a driving market. There's also a lot of subsidies from the government. So there's expectation of growth on the electric vehicles market. That being said, it can also be complicated. We know there's a semiconductor shortage that has been looming and lasting. And for electric vehicles, they highly rely on semiconductors. So it will also depend on that, how well the market goes for Korean car manufacturers in Europe.
Right, and speaking about semiconductors, Thomas, there's a belief that the US may very likely this autumn, perhaps limit South Korea's production of advanced chips made over in China. How does that look to affect regional trade, do you think? We have like about a minute left.
Well, it's, this is another case where I think Korea is really kind of in the middle of like a larger global, geopolitical battle, spilling into business. And, for Korea, it's a challenge because they're such a semiconductor, driven export economy. I think it's 20% of the economy, and 40% of those exports go to China. So it's a major, potential blow. It hasn't officially been announced yet, but I think, again, it's coming into this thing of a longer term picture of how is the global market shaking out. And, Korea probably is going to have to make a choice, to get in one camp or the other. I mean, they haven't agreed to the Chip 4 alignment yet, but Japan and Netherlands have also, have a deal with the U.S. to limit their equipment shipments for semiconductor industry to China. So it's kind of the tides are shifting, but South Korea is going to have a challenge to navigate this. It's such a major sector of the economy.
Right, it really is. All right, Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Nicolas, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. See you same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday. Thank you for now.